Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band podcast. I am your host, Benedikt, and today I'm here with my co-host and friend, Malcolm Owen Flood, as always, but we're also joined by, and please forgive me if I completely butcher your name now, Dave Piatek. Is that right?
Oh, so close. Piatek.
Piatek. Okay. I should have asked before. Hey, Dave, thank you so much for taking the time to joining us today and joining us today on this podcast. Dave is the co-founder of a company called Room Sound, and they make drum samples, drum sample libraries, virtual drum instruments. And they are, I've said it before on the show, and I will say it again, they are by far my favorite drum samples that I use on most of my mixes for various reasons, and we're going to get into why that is. And I'm so excited to be able to talk to Dave today about all of this, because there's something about Room Sound samples and libraries that to me is just different than all the other tools I've been using for years. And I have a couple of questions because I want to know why that actually is and why they work so well for me. And then, we're going to dive into, hopefully, he'll give us a little insight on how to make things like that and how to use them properly. And then all things recording and samples, hopefully. So again, thank you. Welcome to the show. Thank you for taking the time. I hope you're doing well.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me on. And yes, I am doing well. I'm excited to get into it.
I just want to say thanks as well, Dave. It's great having you on. Maybe to start, you could just kind of give the listeners your usual elevator pitch on who you are yourself and what Room Sound's all about.
Okay. Well, my name is Dave Piatek. I got started kind of like in the punk rock scene, probably like a lot of people. I've kind of always and I'm real hyped up right now because I saw the Descendants last night. They played like down the street from where I live, and they're like my ultimate favorite like punk rock band. And so I'm all pumped up on this now. But so anyway, I started off playing like in punk rock bands and stuff when I was like in high school and stuff like that. We didn't have any money. That was like 20 some years ago. I mean, I think I'm probably a little older than I look. And at that point, it was like, if you wanted to make a record or whatever, you kind of had to do it yourself because we didn't have any money. The studios were not plentiful. And the ones that were good were just like financially completely out of reach for us, which I think kind of gets to a lot of your audience, right? Like even now, I think that's the audience that you guys are speaking to here, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, like I've always kind of been like an all-purpose kind of nerd, and I like to figure stuff out. And so I was like, well, let me get a 4-track, like a cassette 4-track. I'm going to buy, the home recording guide, the Bobby, I forget how to pronounce his last name. It starts with an, yeah.
Bobby Osinski.
Bought that. Yeah. And then I was like, all right, let's do this. I bought a couple mics and, whatever. And so I was always the guy, as the bands I was in got more serious, like I was the guy, like, elbows up on the console, like, hey, what you doing there, recording guy? And that's sort of how I got into it, And in the year 2000, we went to New York and we made a record with a guy named Don Fury, who, to us at the time, like we're pretty big into hardcore and punk rock. He did like Agnostic Front and Madball and H2O, who I actually saw yesterday. But and the whole time it was just like this magical thing. And I was like, you know what, like, I enjoy being in a band like way less than I enjoy this studio thing. Mm-hmm. And so from that point on, I was like, well, this is kind of the direction I want to go. Like, I want to be in the studio. And so, a few years later, the consumer version of Pro Tools came out with like Pro Tools LE and the M Box and the 002. And I just started, I bought that and I was like, all right, well, I'm going to record my friends' bands. And I slowly but surely, I became a professional recording engineer that way. Mm-hmm. And then in 2011, a friend of mine, his name is Jamie Wolford. He's a fantastic recording engineer. He also fronts the band called The Stereo. They were like an old Fueled by Ramen band. They just actually put out a new record, so plug for them. Check that out. I helped record drums on that one. Awesome. But anyway, like we got together and he was doing like a recording workshop thing out in Phoenix where he lived. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to come out for that. I might learn some stuff because, I can always learn something, right? And as part of that workshop, he recorded some drum samples at this awesome studio called STEM Recording in Phoenix. And at the end of it, like I took the samples home and I was like, oh man, these samples are amazing. And like, it wasn't like anything else that was on the market. And I like real drums, and not to name any names, but there is one particular company that's kind of famous for making samples that are like, sound like the Death Star exploding, and they advertise it as such, as a good thing. But to me, I'm just like, yeah, that's not what real drums sound like. Like I want drum samples that sound like real drums. So anyway, I used the crap out of these like samples that we just like recorded very quickly as part of this workshop. And I was like, I don't know how long later, maybe a month later, I called Jamie up. I was like, hey man, these samples are awesome. We should do another one, and we should do it like, we should really get in there, sample multiple drums, do all this stuff. Now, Grant, keep in mind, this is like maybe 2010 or 2011. So it was a while ago. And the technology is not what it is now. So we basically went through and, we collaborated on it, and we did a library, but originally it was just going to be for us, right? So we both wanted this thing. We wanted more drums or whatever. We didn't do any cymbals. It was just all shells. And Jamie is the most amazing drum tech I've ever met to this day. He's way better than me. And he's so good at tuning drums and keeping them in tune, which you need for samples. Yeah. We did this like library that was just for us, and it was awesome, but it wasn't as good as it could be. I'm always like looking to improve. Every time I do something, I like to best whatever came before. I was like, okay, well, this is cool. It solved a bunch of my problems with the last set of samples, but like more,
Right.
And eventually I was like, you know what? Like if we want this, and we find this useful, I'll bet you there's a million other people who would also find this useful. I think we might have a product here. And so we formed a company, Jamie and I, and then we went in and did like our first like real release where we went in. And those products, they were just basically like trigger instruments and wave files. I mean, it was like the Wild West back in 2011, like there wasn't all the software landscape was not the same as it is now.
Right. Yeah.
And then from there, we got a call from Jay Moss, who you've had on the podcast here.
Yes.
And he just like, I didn't know him. And all of our partners have been like this. Like, I didn't know Jay. And he was like, oh man, I love your stuff, and I was like, oh, well, thank you very much. And we got to talking, and that's how we got to working on a drum library. And it's all been like very organic like that. And then, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we kind of transitioned into the Contact platform, which allowed us to do all kinds of cool stuff like cymbals. And, that was the first Kurt Ballou library that we did. And it's been great. Jamie, he sort of like, it got a lot more serious, I think, than Jamie was really in it for, like it was taking a lot more of his time. And he's got a career in audio, he's got a family and all this stuff. And so, around that time, he kind of like, stepped back from the company, and it's just kind of been me running it ever since. So, yeah. But it's all like based on that like punk rock ethos of like, well, there's a thing that should exist. You can either wait for it to exist for someone else to do it, or you can just like dig in, figure it out, and do it yourself. Like I have a little bit of background in computer programming, but I mean, I had to do a lot of learning,
right?
To make this stuff happen. So
for sure,
that was probably a little longer, a long-winded answer, maybe longer than you were looking for. But
that was
that's basically my like origin story with drum samples.
That's great.
I think that was perfect, and there's so much to unpack. And I made notes as we went because I wanted to ask a couple of questions on that. So first of all the way back to Don Fury for a second, because are you like he was all, or still is maybe all analog, right? He doesn't use any digital. Like you didn't record digitally with him, probably, right?
No, we did record digitally.
Oh, really?
So, yeah.
He's known for like doing very simple live sessions to tape and stuff like that without like any computers involved. Like at least that's the stuff that I heard mostly about him. So,
well, I think, Don Fury, I learned a lot during that session. Like when you look back at your life and you think about like defining moments that sort of like set the course for your life, like recording with Don Fury was one of them for me. Mm-hmm. I mean, it wasn't necessarily all exactly what I wanted it to be. Like there are things now when I look back, I'm like, oh, like I wish we would have done this differently, because I'm, but back then he was this like guy that was like untouchable because he made some of my favorite records, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that he records it, like even back then, he's a pretty forward-looking guy in terms of technology. At that point, he was working on an ADAT system, those old like SVHS tapes. And again, this was in 2000. So like the computer recording really wasn't, the computers weren't fast enough to do it. And he still does it in a way, or did it then and does it now in a way that is like analog tape. The only thing that's different is instead of analog tape, he uses a digital system, but the workflow is the exact same as analog. So like he's got a console, he's got the, you know, he doesn't do like Pro Tools drum edits or any of that stuff. Like, and all the like live to tape stuff he does is the same way.
I'm just asking because Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, that's all I got. I don't want to speak for him. I haven't talked to him in years, but you know,
things
like,
might have changed.
From what I understand, that's what he still does. Because he moved out of New York because it was too expensive, and he moved to his studio to Troy, New York, which is very close to where my wife is from, actually. But I should actually reconnect with him at some point.
Yeah, probably. Like, would be interesting to see what the workflow and like what he's doing right now, actually. So I'm asking because I found it interesting that after that you started your own recording journey, but you went straight to like buying a computer and like the M-Box and the interface and all that, an early Pro Tools version.
Embracing the technology, yeah.
Yeah, so you didn't want to go down the analog workflow or do what he did basically, but you embraced the new way of making records basically right away.
I mean, that was almost purely a financial decision.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, like, I understand signal flow. Like, you know, I just turned 41. So like I'm old enough that I sort of came up like in a hybrid kind of mentality, right? Like all the signal flow from the old school, like analog stuff, like I get that, you know, but then also like I'm a digital native too, right? I'm like the perfect age to kind of like step into both of those worlds.
Yeah.
And it was just super clear to me. I mean, obviously it was cheaper and easier to do it that way, but it just, even back then in what was probably 2003 or 2004, like there was enough happening on the computer in Pro Tools where I was like, this is clearly the way things are going to be.
Right.
You know, and I think a lot of the people that made the transition from analog to digital, it was difficult for them because there's things you do in analog, meaning like analog tape, that you just cannot do in digital, right? Like with analog tape, and I'm sure we'll probably talk about this later when we talk about the tape samples in the new library. Like you can push those levels into the tape in a very kind of like I mean, you have to calibrate the thing. There's no doubt about that. But like you can kind of be a little loosey-goosey with the level that you send in. You know, if it's a little hot in certain places, no big deal, right? Like, and if you try to treat digital that way, all you're going to get is like odd order harmonic distortion that sounds terrible. So I think that's really the thing. If you approach digital not the way that you approach analog, but you think about it as this perfect thing, you know, that it is going to give you what comes into it. You know, like there's no like magic in the box. So if you think about it that way, then you can make records that sound every bit as good, and honestly, in a lot of cases, probably better than what you could with analog. You just got to treat it like what it is. And I feel the same way about like guitar amp sims, right? I mean, you can see behind me, like I have a couple amps. Like I love those amps.
Nice amps.
But like when I do but I have no problem using like a DI and amp sims because I'm not trying to treat the amp sim like these things. It's its own thing. And if you just like address it and be like, well, let me put away my preconceived notions about what this is and just like make it sound good, well, then there you go. Yeah. You know?
Well, 100%. 100%. I'm just, I was asking mainly because if you want to make something, if you want to get into something like making virtual instruments and stuff, as you said, it takes a lot of time in front of the computer, learning all of that, and you sort of have to like that. So if you were the Don Fury type of guy, like I don't know if you would have, you know, if you would have went down that path necessarily. So you kind of like working on a computer, I guess, and like creating these things there. And as you said, you're a digital native, so this is just part of it. Yeah, it's okay. So that was the first question that I had. The other question was, you said it started with those early room sound samples, which I also still remember, but I might be wrong, but I don't think they are available anymore. Is that right? Because I think you now only have the signature libraries, but I might completely be wrong. But I remember going to your website when there was the JMAS Volume 1 library that you had, which was not a contact instrument, but like trigger TCI files and WAV files, I think. And then there was the room sound samples that were not a signature thing. And I remember that. And then it switched to the signature stuff that we see now. Is that correct? And if so, why did they disappear? Because they were great, honestly, the original room sound samples.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. You're going to make me blush here. We did our first 3 libraries are not available anymore, and that's the first 2 like room sound branded libraries, and then the collaboration with JMOS and SJC. And that's just because, like, as a company, I remember Apple back in the 90s when the company was like failing. And one of the things that Steve Jobs did when he came back to the company was he simplified the product line. And he said, like, his whole thing was like, I know this is going to upset some people, but we got to consolidate some things. We have to have like more consistent branding. We can't have 1,000 different models. Like people are going to be confused by that, right? And it was the same way with our previous libraries. Like they weren't Kontakt Player, so you had to actually own the full version of Kontakt if you wanted to use the Kontakt version. There were TCI files, there were WAV files, and I don't, like I have my thoughts about Slate products. Trigger is a good product for certain uses, but as far as the realism that you can get out of it with our samples, it is not the greatest way to trigger samples, because a lot of what makes our samples work well is not just, everybody thinks like, oh, well, the way to get realism is you throw a bunch of multi-samples at it, right? Like you sample it 1 million times and, RAM usage goes through the roof and that's how you get realism. But that's not actually true. Not if you want to do it in a way that is authentic sounding. And I play drums, so, and I'm especially attuned to drums. And so a large part of what makes the stuff sound realistic is the thousands and thousands and thousands of lines of code. It's kind of like a fly-by-wire kind of system, right? And that's something that Trigger can't do. Like there's no customization in Trigger instruments. It's just firing samples. So that's the main reason why we don't offer TCIs. And that's probably like the one of the biggest support questions you get is like, oh man, like why don't you guys offer the TCIs? And it's just like, well, you like the way our drum samples sound? They don't sound like that as a TCI. Like it requires all this like back end processing and kind of like fly by wire. Like when you say, hey, give me a snare drum with most samplers and Trigger included, it's just like, okay, well, what's the velocity? Let me send you a random sample. And it randomizes it, and that's the extent of it. With our libraries, it's like, okay, cool. You want a snare drum hit. What other snare drum hits have been played recently? What voices are active currently? How long has it been since the last snare drum hit? Because that's all going to pull from different sample pools, and that's the thing that makes it sound realistic. So because of that, those first 3 libraries, I'll be honest, because I do all the Kontakt development, I was not nearly as good at programming in Kontakt. And Kontakt has its own custom programming language. It's a pretty fully featured programming language. So, that's why those particular libraries aren't around anymore. Is just because I'm like crazy about the quality of and the realism, and they just weren't up to snuff. That's basically it.
Yeah. That was basically my story with drum samples and why I came to like these so much and use your samples almost exclusively now, because I felt like for some genres, like especially like modern, polished sort of metal stuff, there is plenty of good solutions out there, and there have been for a while, and I've used them all the time, and it works well. But whenever you want to do something punk rock, indie, hardcore, some subgenres of metal, and I come from a punk rock background myself. I've played in hardcore bands for years, and I just always loved realistic sounding drums. And when I wanted to do something like that, which was most of the time, I always felt limited by the available tools. Trigger, for the exact reasons that you mentioned. And then also other stuff, like as much as I like, for example, the tracker in Superior Drums, it's great for like getting the MIDI information out of the actual drums. But then when you want to layer it with the samples and not just replace them, you run into other issues. Some samples are not cut accurately, or, and then every single library has its own sort of flaws, or some, as you mentioned, sound just too over the top, just too processed, and the velocities are weird. You can never use 127 because it's just crazy, and like all these things, and like none of these solutions were perfect. And then I found Room Sound, and it just gave me all of that. And it was the first time I remember using it, like the first Kurt Ballou, but also Bober Gel really was what sort of that one was just crazy to me. I remember using that for the first time on a song that had like quiet ghost notes and like snare rolls building up and stuff like that. And it was the first time I thought my triggered samples sounded not just like the original performance, but actually better. I was able to blend them, make it sound better, but still like the original performance in a way. And that's just, that's exactly why I love these samples so much. To be honest, I never really use the built-in processing. Might be great, but I have to be honest, I just never really use it as much. I just use the samples because they are amazing. I use them like a kit. I send the multi-outs to the DAW, layer them with the existing drums, treat them as if I'd recorded a drum kit, and that's what I do with it, and it works. And I don't really think about, I don't even realize I'm using samples. I print them, they're in the session, they're perfect, and that's what I want. And so, and it's interesting to hear that you come from punk rock background yourself and had these same problems, obviously, with other products, and that's why you make these. Like, makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting to think, because when people go hunting for drum libraries, they're usually just looking at the sound of the samples, not really considering the brains of the software behind it, like the actual program you've coded, and what that brings to the table. Like I, for one, hadn't considered that.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
That's
sure.
very cool. Now, I'm curious, when you were creating this product, obviously you wanted to, you realized that people would want it, but you were first and foremost making it for yourself to solve a problem you had. Were you wanting to make it to layer with real drums, or to create an all-in-one, this is going to sound like a drum kit on its own, and we don't even need to record drums? Like, obviously both are possible, but what was your goal going into it?
Well, I think that sort of depends on where you catch me in the development of the company, right?
Oh,
like
cool.
the first set of things that we made, we didn't even do cymbals.
Right.
And, it was designed to be a replacement library, like drum replacement or augmentation.
Dave, sorry to cut you off real quick, but I just have to say it at this point, because this is almost exactly a question that we got from our audience. So I'm just going to ask it now because it's almost the same as you had, Malcolm. Because Daniel James from our community, I wanted to just mention the people who also have these questions. His name is Daniel James. He's from our community, and he asked, as the maker of this product, what was your original vision for how they would be used, and how has that ended up differently to what you intended? So basically, same question. But I just wanted to give this shout out to Daniel. Thank you for asking.
Okay. Well, thanks for your question. So yeah, it started off as, replacement augmentation. That's what we wanted to use it for. As things kind of progressed and things got more serious, the reception from the start was so much better, than we anticipated. And this is basically my full-time job now, is doing room sound. And it started off just as like, we'll do this little thing. We'll set up a web store, no big deal, So as that first library kind of like got some interest, and Jay, there are so many people that bought that I was kind of like, I was super, I can't say who it was, but they were like some big time people that bought it and loved it. And I was like, oh, well, maybe our reach can be a little broader here. If this is having such a good kind of reception, I'll bet you there's a whole bunch of other people that would be interested in this. And I'm kind of a dork, and I love doing new stuff. So I was like, well, I feel like we kind of figured out, how to do shells, but cymbals, that's a challenge, right? Yeah. And so, everything to me is just like a puzzle to solve. And so I sat down for a couple of days, and I was like, all right, well, how would I do cymbals? And this is years ago. This is before, I'm way better at programming in Contact and doing everything now. But even at that basic level, I was like, I'll bet you I could figure out cymbals. And we did, and and it's been constantly evolving. And then it was like, well, you know what? There's a whole market for this for people that are not engineers, right? Because I'm an engineer, you guys are engineers, but there's way more like guitar players that just want kind of good sounding drums, right? So, if you remember from the old products, there was no built-in processing, right? Nope. Like Benedikt, you're talking about, not using the built-in processing. And you know what? That's the exact use case we envision. But all the people that just want a finished sound, that's also the use case that we envision, right?
Right.
So the way that this all came together was basically we record the samples. I sort of put them together in the instrument, and then our partners, our signature partners like Kurt or Bo or Jay, or the blasting room guys, I delivered the instrument to them, and there's all these mixing tools built in, and I'm like, okay, mix it like a record, and there's your presets. So you can change it. Nothing's baked in, but there's enough of those processing tools that, basically you can have a finished sound from a stereo output, which is the use case for like all the guitar players that just want kind of kick-ass drum sounds to play along to and to compose with. Like, because I think that's important, right? Like there's a lot of recordists and they know how to, like you're saying, like, you just use the samples and you know how to process them. But there's plenty of people that don't want to learn how to do all that.
Yeah.
And so that's another audience. And so the question is like, how do you serve both those audiences? I know we might be kind of getting into the weeds here with the question, but like, I envisioned it originally as a tool for recordists, but it expanded to be everybody, because everybody should have access to great drums,
Yes, 100%. And I think even like people who know how to process them or mix them or whatever, even they benefit from it, because if you want to do a quick demo or just capture an idea, or sometimes things have to just move fast, and then it's perfect that you have these presets. Like, yeah, I totally. Or if you're just a fan of somebody's drum sound and you want to recreate that or see what's going on, or like for me, I'm such a huge Kurt Ballou fan, and when the first Kurt Ballou library came out, I didn't even do anything. Like I immediately went to the God City preset and just picked one of the MIDI loops and hit play, and it sounded like my favorite Kurt Ballou records because he's such a signature sound. And I was like, that's what I've always wanted to do, and I never achieved it. Like, and now I have to just see what is going on here. So it's just super interesting to see that too when it comes to signature libraries, to just see how people treat them. Or Bo's, what's the crazy multi-instance mix preset that he has, where it's like multiple instances for different things.
Oh, the ultimate mix preset.
Yeah, that one. But that approach, I would have never came up with an approach like that, and it was so cool to see that, and so useful too. So that alone, like the learning experience, was cool for me. So that made the processing and the presets worth it.
That's interesting. You're kind of reverse engineering how they mix drums from these presets, because you can literally look at how the mix is set up inside of the drum software. That's awesome. I like that.
Yeah. And I got to throw it out to Native Instruments. Native Instruments has been a fantastic partner. Kontakt is such an amazing platform. I mean, there's little things about it I would change for sure, but in terms of being a partner, like you can't beat the efficiency, the sound quality. I mean, they really have it figured out, like the Kontakt engine. And that's really, I couldn't do this in any other sampler. Everybody's always like, oh, we hate using Kontakt. Can you like switch to another sampler? I don't want to. Like, It is such a mature platform. It is so good at RAM handling, and it's very CPU efficient. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
totally.
I'm so curious, because I've got a little bit of experience with writing code just through curiosity and taking some courses and stuff like that. I've got some experience with making drum samples, but I've only ever done just straight up one-shots and stuff like that. And then I've never bothered with like, cymbals. And then there's also inside of this, there's MIDI grooves and stuff like that. There's so much stuff. How long does it kind of take to put one of these libraries together for you, just in like the ballpark approximate? Because it seems like an enormous task.
Oh, it's crazy. Like people sometimes ask about like, well, what's the secret? Like, and like some people would be like, oh, well, like I'm sure you can't like discuss all the stuff you're doing behind the scenes. And I always say, like, I'll tell anybody who wants to know exactly what I do, because there's no secret to it. It's just mind-numbing, detail-oriented work for months and months and months. Like, if you want to go and steal it, steal my techniques, go for it. Like, you probably don't have the mental fortitude to get through it. That's really what it is. Like, that's my like, intellectual property dongle, if you will.
Yeah.
Right? It's just like, if you want to do it this way, you go for it. But you better give up on your life for a year,
Right.
To your point about the sample cutting, like I cut personally every sample by hand, denoise by hand, listen to them, like audition the whole sample. I don't like do automatic anything because of what you described, right?
It's unbelievable that this happens, honestly. Like, it's unbelievable to me that this even happens. Like, some of the major samplers, like, we couldn't figure out why we weren't able to blend them with our real drums. Programming was kind of fine, but, like, blending was impossible until we printed and looked at every single sample. And it turns out that some were cut into the waveform. Others had a couple of samples of space before it, and, like, all over the place. And it kind of was fascinating to see that this actually happens. And it was not a small company, right? So
Yeah, I mean, that's been my experience too. I mean, everything that I do is based on, my reaction to things that I did not like in other commercially available products. Like, I did not set out to be like a drum sample company owner. Like, if somebody had made the thing that I wanted, we wouldn't be sitting here talking.
Yeah.
And you'd have years of your life back.
Yeah. But I mean, that's really the thing is like, this newest library, I mean, granted, COVID and that created a bunch of delays, but I mean, we've been working on it for 3 years.
Wow.
And that, I mean, I have done a lot of other stuff in the meantime. It's not my only gig. I still make records. I teach at a college. I teach audio production courses, like a couple courses every semester. So it's not like this is the only thing I do. But I mean, in large part for the last 3 years, this is what I've been working on. And, I think it's one of the things that I always said, and I'm going to try to keep this going as long as I can, is like, you have to be really careful when you're setting up a company about how you set up the company. Room Sound is definitely not the biggest drum sample maker, and that's fine by me. If we hired a bunch of people and had a huge marketing department and all this stuff, like, I mean, I'm biased, but I think with the quality of our product, we could be way bigger. But the problem with that is once you take on all that overhead, all that staffing, I'm of the opinion, like, when you hire somebody, you are making a commitment to that person that your job is relatively secure. Like, you're never going to have to worry about your paycheck bouncing, and the company is going to make decisions that enable that. Right. And so I get it with a lot of the companies that maybe the products aren't quite as well thought through because they have all this enormous overhead and they have bills to pay and they have people that depend on them and they have to get their products out. I did not want to spend 3 years working on this Kurt library. I was hoping it would be out in a year. But after a year, I was like, this is not right yet. It's gotta be right. And because our overhead is so low and we are such a small company, like that's the thing that enables us to do these things and not take the route where we're like, all right, we have X amount of time to cut these up. And if it cannot take longer than this, because then, the budget for marketing and all this stuff, it's like that video game Cyberpunk 2077, right? Like that game could have been awesome, but like, because of all of the overhead and all that stuff, like they had to get it out at a certain time and whatever. Like, and for Room Sound products, like that, it's so much of me goes into that. And I really want it to be quality. So, 3 years on this one. The next thing that we do is not going to take 3 years. Like, oh man, I hope not. But you know what? If it does, it does. And when it comes out, it will be 3 years later and it'll be right. And I'll be 100% proud of every aspect of it, and also for our partners, like Kurt's name is on it. Yeah. Jay's name is on his, Bo's is on his, the Blasting Room guys, like every single person, I want them to be stoked about the thing that comes out. And if that takes 3 years, it takes 3 years.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I love that.
So
love that approach.
We should talk about your new library. Give us the elevator pitch on that.
Well, it's just a continuation of, what we've been doing for just basically since the beginning. It's kind of like the ultimate manifestation of my obsession with having, virtual drums that sound real and indistinguishable from real drums. Kurt, by now, we have known each other a long time. I know what he's about. He knows what I'm about. And I've gotten a lot better at what I do. So one of my favorite bands that Kurt works with is a band called Russian Circles. And their drummer, Dave Turnkrantz, is also one of my favorite drummers. And they're a Chicago band. And so, Kurt and I talk all the time. And when we were in this planning stages for this, he's like, hey, what would you think about going out to Chicago and doing a record at doing a library at Electrical? And instantly I was like, ooh, this is something, because for those of you who don't know, Electrical Audio is the studio owned by Steve Albini, who's another famous recording engineer. And it's a primarily tape-based studio. I mean, they are 100% caught up on all the new digital stuff. They're not like backwards leaning. I mean, the studio is awesome, but the rooms in that studio they kind of have a life of their own. And I was like, oh man, I am totally interested in this. Now, if you're familiar with Kurt, like he's kind of famous for doing a lot of processing on the way in. And certainly the first version of his library that we recorded at his personal studio, we leaned on a lot of his like compression and EQ and stuff on the way in. And so that's what gives us its signature sound, right?
Yeah.
But with this one, I was like, you know what? Like, I want this to be more versatile. So he got sounds and used his like EQ techniques and stuff on the way in. And then right before we hit record, we just switched it all off.
Oh, well.
So he kind of knew that he was getting what he needed. But then the idea was, well, we're going to record all these things raw. We'll take them back to God City. We can mix them there. We can use the internal effects so that, you know, if you don't want, you know, like the Kurt Blue sound, you can just take that off. And it just sounds like amazingly recorded and sampled and played drums in this legendary studio. So you can kind of make it sound like anything. And that was the thing about this library, is like, we were aiming for like ultimate versatility. Mm-hmm. So like we didn't like sample a ton of kit pieces, but we sampled stuff that would be good, that using the included tools, you can basically do anything you want with it without having analysis paralysis. Because like, I don't care about having 10 snare drums that all sound basically the exact same. Like, I would much rather have like a few that all have dramatically different character, and then you can shape them. And that's sort of what we did here. So yeah, I mean, I could talk forever about this library. Like I said, it's been 3 years in the making, and yeah,
it's ridiculous. Like it's totally bonkers. Like I was hoping for it to be that, because I love the initial Kurt Ballou one, but as you said, like that just sounds like Kurt Ballou no matter what you do, basically. I mean, yeah, there's more to it than that, but like that wouldn't do it justice probably. But still, it has a signature sound, and I ended up using the Bow one or the Blasting Room ones or one of the others for other stuff a lot. And this one, I was hoping for it to be more versatile, but would still maybe get some of that Kurt sound if I want to. And that's exactly what I experienced when I tried it. Let's talk about maybe some of these details that you put in there also, because I think part of the versatility is not really the different shells that you can choose, but things like 2 different pairs of overheads, one being condensers, one being ribbons. One is like a space pair, one is like, I think I'm correct here, like a space pair, and the other one is Bloomline or XY or something, 2 different configurations.
ORTF.
Yeah.
Which is a near coincident position.
Yeah. And like these things are so useful, because you can get something wider or tighter. You can get, or narrower, you can get it like more open or tighter. You have so much control over how the kit sounds and feels. With the exact same drums, but just by picking the right microphone combination, and then all these rooms, of course. And I'm very curious to hear about that too, because how did you, as far as I remember, there were multiple rooms used in this one library. Like, how is that possible at Electrical? And if so, like, how did you pull that off to have like the different rooms all baked into this one thing, basically?
So Electrical is a huge complex, and they actually have 2 studios that are not physically connected. They have the main, like what we call Studio A, which is basically like an Adobe brick room. And that's the one, it kind of like looks the coolest. And you see it in all like the document, like the Dave Grohl Sonic Highways thing. That's the studio they were in for that. And it's like more of kind of like a pro, like, what you would sort of traditionally think of as a recording studio. Like, it's big, it's set up in that way, it's got multiple rooms, and it sounds great. I would say it's like kind of a little bit more like designed than Studio B, which was the original studio. So the story goes like Steve Albini, he purchased this complex, and at the time he had a home studio that he was working out of, and he sold his house to help finance the purchase of the studio. And Studio B was the first one that was ready, and it's kind of like a little, I don't want to say rougher, but it's like a little more punk rock, And while he was working in Studio B, they finished construction on Studio A, which is like the more fancy of the 2 studios. The thing about Studio B, though, is it's cheaper to work in there. And so a lot of my favorite bands, like my favorite like punk rock records, were done in the cheaper studio. And it has, the live room there has this, it's huge, it's all like masonry, and it's really tall. It's like 2 stories tall. And so the drums just sound bonkers cool in there. Yeah. But if you don't want that sound, it's hard to take that like real like Zeppelin-y kind of room sound out of the drums in there, unless you throw it in the ISO booth, and it's a whole thing. So the idea was always we were going to record the library in room A. But I was like, you know what? Like, this is going to be like, let's just rent the whole complex, because we're going to have to do that anyway. Because unless the isolation is total, you can't have somebody like wailing on a bass amp. Right. Even though the isolation between the studios is really good, like you can't have any noise for sampling. So I'm going to have to rent the whole place anyway. I'm going to have to, book out both rooms. Since I'm already going to be paying for that, why don't we just like book out a second engineer and a second drummer, and we'll sample the drums twice in Studio A and Studio B. But Studio B will only care about the room mics, because we can use the close mics from Studio A. And I had this idea, one of the things about our libraries is like, I have this like, it's like musicality by spreadsheet. It's like the sampling process is so detailed, like down to, we meter stuff by like 1/10 of a dB for consistency. So like the sampling drummers, I've never had a sampling drummer that agreed to do a library with me twice, because the process is so insane. But so I thought to myself, like, well, this process is so defined and dialed in. I'll bet you that we could blend Studio A and Studio B together, and you'd never know the difference, that it was played at a different time by a different drummer.
Right.
And so when we set out to do this, it was a big experiment. I was like, I don't know if this is going to work.
Yeah.
But I hired, like one of my childhood friends. He was an amazing drummer. His name's Chris Lepre. And I was like, you know what? If you're cool, like come out, like this is going to be an experiment. So Dave Turnkrantz, and Kurt handled their business in Studio A, and John Sampalo, who's a staff engineer at Electrical, and my good friend Chris went through the process in Studio B. And then at the end, I put them together. And it wasn't until the instrument was basically done that I was like, did this work?
Right.
Turns out it did. So you can actually physically blend Studio A and Studio B together with this library. You cannot do that in real life. This is the only way to do that.
Yeah.
And it sounds amazing, because you have this like Adobe Brick close mic kind of Studio A sound, which sounds like awesome. But then if you want to get that bombastic Studio B sound, you can just put it up on a fader and it totally works.
That's
Crazy.
the third room.
The only thing
right?
I can think of that's
close. That's the last room.
Yeah. No. The only thing I can think of that's close to doing this that I've heard of in real life is like Bob Rock setting up a PA system in another room and re-recording like rooms like that or something, which is like...
We actually tried that.
Oh, yeah?
But it just doesn't sound right. Like it sounds kind of like a room, but there's nothing like, a drummer hitting like a nice deep rim shot, in the room, like actually generating from the drum.
Wow.
I mean, I would have loved to have done it that way, because it would have been so much simpler.
To replay them
like
all.
I cannot tell you the amount of time I spent on sample prep to make sure all of this stuff worked together. So,
well, I'm glad it worked. That's awesome.
Yeah. Tell us about the process of sampling then, maybe, because that's something I think a lot of people don't really get, because what most of us have done before is probably what you said, Malcolm, is like record a bunch of one-shots, or just record some samples in the beginning of the sessions, or you could layer them later, or replace hits and stuff like that. But like the way what you need to do for these libraries is way different than that. And then cymbals, of course, are their own thing. So what goes actually into the process of making samples like that? What do you have to watch out for? I know there's a million things, but maybe a couple of key things that like anyone should know about who wants to make even just a small library for it to work well in the end. Like, what are some things? Like, what's the process like broken down?
I mean, so I think that doing sampling is not dissimilar from just making a record, right? Like, you can go into a record with no pre-production, and you can come out with a recording. But like, if you really want to work at a high level, you kind of have to go in with a plan. And that's the thing. A lot of times when people talk about samples, yeah, I mean, and I have a lot of friends that are just like, oh man, this is so cool. I want to do this. Like, can you tell me like how to do it like a real simple way? And I'm like, no, because pre-production, I mean, like, I'll tell you how I do it, but it's not going to be simple. Like, there's no way to do it simply and have the level of quality that you need to really do it. Now, if you just want to build out a little library for yourself, I mean, that is very simple, right? But if you really want to get into this like sort of deep sampling thing, there's no simple way to do it. You have to sit there and meticulously think about it. And I'm very like sort of process oriented. And one of the things that I like to do is define these things in very distinct stages. So when I'm planning a library, I mean, I don't really do this anymore because we've kind of like worked out our sampling system. But at the beginning, like I was saying with earlier when I was talking about the cymbals, like it's like, okay, before I record note 1 or hit 1 of a cymbal library, like you got to go through and say, okay, what is every single way that this thing can be played? How, and it's not just like, well, you can hit it, you can crash on it, you can play it on the bow, how do these different articulations interact with each other, right? So it's like the way to really think about it is that way. And once you think about it that way, then you're like, okay, well, then I sort of understand how the engine has to work in order to make this sound realistic, and I can sample to that end, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, as far as just the detail goes, I mean, we have a lot of times when people sample, they'll be like, okay, I'm going to play 10 hits. I'm going to go from the softest I can hit to the loudest I can hit. And then I'll chop those up and I'll put them in and I'll velocity map them. I mean, that works, but it's not realistic. So what we did was we figured out like sort of this velocity chart of like, well, that corresponds exactly to MIDI values and the scaling in the contact sampler. So we're like, okay, well, if you play it at this, at this velocity, if you send MIDI velocity, 96 in, what is the peak value that should be? Now we're going to write that down. Now we're going to have the drummer play until they hit that value exactly.
Right.
But with
How do you
the
know?
left hand, the right. Well, you have to meter it every single hit. I'm metering the exact peak value.
But is it just really just peak value, and not like how it sounds, like the attack and all of it? Because sometimes a hit might be louder, but not sound as impactful as maybe a quieter hit. Like that's at least how I think about it. Like, is it really just the peak value?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, it's the peak value when you're sampling, and then you fill in all that other feel stuff on the back end with the software.
Yeah. Oh, God.
Right. So I put this thing together, right, and then I have an electronic drum kit that's like super dialed. And I'll just play, press rolls and nuanced stuff. And I'm like, oh, this doesn't feel right. Mm-hmm. Let me tweak the code, and I do that for every drum. I do that for every cymbal. But the thing that's important is that you have this very, very consistent way that you ingest the samples so that then the engine can know what is happening. And that's what the peak value is all about. Oh, okay. And that's why, like your listeners might not necessarily be familiar with all of our stuff, but the new Kurt library has a lot of like the engine. It's a complete rewrite of the sampler engine from the ground up. That's part of what took the 3 years. And so the cymbals and everything sounds, what I would say is like kind of like an order of magnitude better and more realistic than previous libraries. And that's not to say that the old libraries don't already sound realistic. They do, but this is just like next level. But what the awesome part is, and this is something that we've got in the plan, is because of the consistency of our sample ingest process, I'm going to go back and we can actually, it's like backwards compatible, the new engine.
Right, okay.
We can apply this to the old samples, and now the old samples can be as realistic as these new ones because our sampling process is so defined and so thought out and so consistent. And that's why no drummer ever wants to do more than one of these with me because I am just an absolute nut when it comes to like the quality of the ingest of the samples.
And you ever someone tell you to just fuck off and like, I don't want to do this anymore. Like I'm out of here. Has that ever happened, or are they patient with you?
No, that has never happened. And to be honest, like whenever I approach a drummer about this, I'm always like, listen, man, like what you think this is going to be is not what it's going to be. This is going to be hard. And they're all just like, they pump out their chest and they're like, I got this, no problem. And then once we get into it, they're like, oh, well, I can't like go back on this now because I was real, I was real macho about being able to do this. But I mean, I'm playing it up a little bit, like,
of course.
And all of the drummers that we've worked with are fantastic. And you can't just be any drummer. It has to be a drummer that I know to have a good sort of, I don't want to say work ethic, but like a good attention to detail and good mental stamina, because that's really what you need. Like you have to be able to hit really well and consistently and all that, but you also have to have the mental stamina. That's easily just as important.
Right.
So
fascinating that two people sound different when all you need to do, like quote unquote, all you need to do is like hit a drum once, that this will sound differently when two people are doing it, especially over the course of a long session like that, and then left hand, right hand, and different articulations and stuff, because you would think like it doesn't matter if you sit down or I sit down or a world-class drummer sits down, should sound the same, but it doesn't. And that's interesting,
Well,
I think.
That's actually that's not totally true.
Okay.
Our sampling process is specific and detailed enough that it largely takes the performance of the drummer out of it.
Okay.
And so, like, when I talk about a drummer being a good drummer, you got to know how to hit a good rim shot, but sure. But once you get to that point where you're hitting the drum, like, in the proper way, it kind of takes the drummer out of it. The real thing that the quality of the drummer that is super important is the ability to do those hits consistently. Because if you can't, it will take twice as long to record. And so that's a big thing. So there's like the mental fortitude part, and then the ability to be consistent is a big thing.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. What about the
cymbals? It sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah, totally.
It's a nightmare hell that you can't even imagine. I put these people
all
through.
the jobs, like being the drummer, being the drum tech, being the engineer. It sounds just so hard across it all.
Well, that's why, like, I always say, like, I will tell anybody that wants to listen what the secret is. It's just being like a weird type A dude who can just sit at a computer for 3 years. and basically, like, I mean, it's not musical. I mean, the end part is where I'm like tweaking the code to make it sound its best, but like, probably 85% of it is like the most mundane, like, it's like spreadsheets. It's like musical spreadsheets, basically.
Totally. Yeah. It's that's so right brain for that part of it, processes, right? But I'm so glad you do it. Thank you.
I do it so you don't have to.
Exactly. It's really great.
What about the other thing that I will say about this is, like, we have currently our entire library is signature libraries, and every single signature person that we partner with is some degree. I mean, they're not all as like sort of crazy as I am about this stuff, but they are all incredibly detail oriented. Like, there have been people that approached us about doing a signature library, and I'm just like, I don't think this is the right fit, because they're more kind of loosey goosey or whatever. It's really, I feel like it's very similar to making a record. Is like, for this sort of thing, like, you have to work with like-minded people that are, it's not, every person is not right for this. And that's fine. There's nothing against those people, Yeah. So.
Yeah, totally.
Benny, you had a question there, I think.
About but only if you don't like. You want to add something to this, Malcolm?
No, go ahead, buddy.
Okay, about the cymbals, I wanted to ask, because that, like, the consistent hits and all of that obviously matters with the shells. It also matters with the cymbals, but sampling cymbals sounds so much more of a nightmare even than the shell part, just because. Imagine a ride cymbal that just rings out forever, and you not only have to do this over and over and over and over again consistently, but you have to wait forever until the thing is like quiet again, and then you can go again. At least that's what I imagine it to be. And like,
you're 100% right.
Yeah, that is kind of even more crazy to me. And then and also, like, what has to go on, like, under the hood of the engine and the sampling is these are like huge samples, right? When we cut a snare hit or something, it's like a short, small in size, also like piece of data, but like if you have a sample of a ride cymbal, that's a long WAV file and also needs a lot of space and all of that, and the thing has to be able to handle those. And so I can just imagine that cymbals are even harder to do. So maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, the cymbals are hard to do just from a sort of a tenacity of the sampling team kind of standpoint, because like you said, a ride cymbal, you gotta wait. I mean, sometimes it's 30 seconds, sometimes it's 45 seconds. You got to let that thing decay completely.
Can you turn this into like a meditation thing or something, like where somebody's hitting something and then it's just.
It's funny that you say that, because like some of the sampling drummers have said, like, it's like that. Yeah. Like, you get into a meditative state when you're doing it. I mean, I don't know. Like, all of your fears, all the things that you think are terrible about doing it are true. Like, they are all true. It's horrible.
I can just picture the drummer like accidentally like resting their drumstick on the snare in front of them, and it's click. Like, oh, we got to do it again. Or there's stool squeaks, or like, Like,
yeah, I always tell them like don't breathe.
Yeah, don't breathe.
Hold your breath.
Hold your breath.
Don't move. Hold your breath. I mean, I'm laying it on kind of thick here, but it is every bit as difficult as you imagine.
Here's a question: do you just bring in one drum at a time, mic that up?
No,
or you have the whole kit.
So, kind of going back to what I was saying before about like, drum sampling is not dissimilar from making a record. Is like we set up the entire drum kit, mic it up together, check the phase as though it's a drum, like a real drum kit. Mm-hmm. So, for listeners that are not like super well versed in recording theory and stuff, when you get a drum kit that you're recording like a real drum kit, there is no such thing as perfect phase. It's a compromise, because anytime you have microphones that are like different distances away from a sound source, you're going to have these phase interactions. And as long as like whenever you do phase checking on a complete drum kit for a record, it's always like a compromise, right? So it's like, how do I adjust the phase relationships so they favor the ones that I want?
Right.
Because you can never get it perfect. But the problem with sampling is like it's this artificial process where it's like, oh, all the things that I wish I could do in real life, I can now do because it's this artificial process where we're doing one hit at a time. We can make every single snare hit perfect. Dead in the center, nice meaty hit. Every sample can be perfect. The phase can be perfect. We can set each drum up individually and make sure the phase is perfect with the overheads and there's no compromises. So you can make this. You can make these hits that are like technically perfect, but that's a problem, right? Because if you want the drums to sound real, the drummer never plays every hit perfectly. Mm-hmm. The phase is never 100%, perfect. It's always a compromise. And so we set up the drum kit as if we're recording it for a record. Obviously we check phase and all the phase relationships are as good as they can possibly be, but they're not perfect.
Right.
Yeah. And so what I like to call it is like systematic imperfection. Like we were talking about how it's like, musical spreadsheets. Like we have systemized all of the mistakes and that drummers make. When you play fast, you play a little bit off center.
Right.
Or, your hits are not all directly in center. They're kind of like all over the place, more the faster you play. That's that sort of like contextual stuff that our engine can do that you can't do in something like Trigger.
Right.
It monitors what's happening. So it's like, oh, well, you're playing fast now. So we're going to draw from different sample pools.
Right.
And that sort of thing.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's kind of like a long-winded answer.
No, that did answer the question for sure. That's really cool. So now here's a question for you, and I'm curious what you prefer, because when I record drums, I do the same thing. I get it as good as I can on the way in, and then that's usually what I roll with. Where I know some people will then go in and align their drums to better the phase relationship. Like in the edit, they'll grab their room mics and move them forward in time so that they're more on top of their close mics in a phase relationship. Generally, I mean, I'm not going to say I haven't done that to some extent, but I generally don't, because part of like that distance is literally what I'm looking for. That is the sound I'm going for. So I'm wondering, when you're building a drum sample library where that's totally possible to do, you could do that with every hit, like you said. What do you like? I
mean, I like drums in a room.
Yeah.
So in large part, like I'm leaving them natural. Yeah. The thing about it is like, I mean, rock and roll is not perfect. It's defined by its imperfections, right? And I'm sort of like this pocket protector nerd. Like I can tell you exactly how far away from the snare drum you should put a microphone if it's tuned to C sharp. Okay. Like I have a spreadsheet where I look at the length, like the physical length of the fundamental at every note value. So if it's like, oh man, well, I got a C sharp, I know exactly how far away from the snare drum that microphone has to be for it to be pretty much perfectly in phase. Wow. Right? But the problem is, well, what about the toms? Mm-hmm. What about the kick drum and the overheads? Like you kind of have to like choose what you're going to optimize, And for me, it's usually the snare drum followed by the kick drum. You could actually absolutely like slide it around in drum sample world, but it just like it misses something. It just, most people don't understand why it doesn't sound right. They just know that it doesn't. because as humans, we're just really attuned to that sort of thing. Even people that aren't involved in music, they're just like, there's just like something doesn't feel right about this.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's part of it, you know, like all the unnatural stuff you can do in a DAW. And I do drum editing when I make records. I do all the modern stuff, but it's like there's a point at which you should stop because you're crossing over the uncanny valley kind of situation. Like I like to stop just short of that uncanny valley.
Yeah.
Right.
Like except for when you're trying to make like supernatural, larger than life sort of record that doesn't have to sound like a real kit, because I gotta say this because some of our listeners might be like, yeah, but I like modern metal where every hit is obviously the same, and you know, some people even like the machine gun aesthetic on fills. That's part of a certain aesthetic of certain genres.
Right.
So we're not saying you can't ever do that, and I've made records where I just used one shots because that was exactly what this record needed. But if you want it to sound like a real drum kit, then what you just explained are all the things you got to do if you want it to be like a real kit, right? So, but it's totally fine if you just want to use one shots, of course. But it's just a different approach and aesthetic.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in a place right now, just generally with technology, where like it's great to be a home recordist right now.
Yeah.
Right. And if you want that kind of like, you know, that hyper processed, larger than life, you know, there are no shortage of companies that do that in a fantastic way, you know. And to be honest, I'm friends with a lot of the people that run those companies. I mean, I'm not gonna say who, but like, you know who they are, you know, and I love their work. You know, they're trying to do a thing and they're nailing it. I mean, for room sound, like, you know, we partner with people that sort of share our aesthetic and share our vision. And there's plenty of room in the marketplace for everybody to eat. You know, there's so many people recording themselves, recording at home. It's great, you know, and me personally, I just want room sound to be like a small part of that big pie, you know?
Yeah. You're filling a specific spot in that pie, though, which is really great. Because like I've mentioned, I've made my own one shots. I use them all the time, actually. I love what I've made, but I have not made like realistic multi-samples. So for that to exist and be available, it's perfect, because that's the hard work I don't want to do. Right? So like
no one wants to do it.
It's much harder to do that. So we need that needs to be filled by people like yourself and your company. So yeah, it really is great that you're doing this. We need it.
Have you ever had people like ask about or like be confused because of the name of the company? I just have to ask that because I had a couple of situations where somebody asked me what I used or what I've done here, or when I'm coaching our students, like at the self-recording band, we have a coaching program and courses and stuff. And when I mentioned room sound samples, I always have to say room sound in brackets the company like samples, because when I just say room sound, people are like, "Wait, you're just using room samples? Like there's no close mics?" And I'm like, "No, I mean the room sound, you know, the company stuff." Did you ever have
room sound,
that?
premium drum samples?
Yeah, exactly. Did you ever have that, or like were people confused about thinking that it's only room samples that you have, or something like that? Was it ever a problem?
At the beginning, it kind of was. I think now, like, I mean, at least in most of the dealings that I have with people, like they recognize, like what it is. You know, we arrived at that name. So my Jamie, my original business partner, he was running a recording studio that he called Room Sound. And when we were putting this thing together, it was like really kind of just like, well, what do we want to call this thing? And he's like, well, I've already got the domain roomsound.com, so we don't have to like get another domain. I'm like, sweet, let's just call it that.
Yeah, and it also fits the thing. Is, you know,
it fits our aesthetic too. Yeah, so we were like, oh yeah, this is perfect. But you know, it's like one of those things like, you're like, my favorite band is Jimmy Eat World. And like, what a dumb name. But like, you know, like after a while, after a while, the name it's not really what it is anymore. It's just, it's like, I mean, like, I don't think like, oh, what a strange name for a band, Jimmy Eat World. It's just, that's the band name. And I think that's the way it is with our company too. You know, it's like room sound, like, man, that's going to be hard to optimize for in a Google search. Wish we would have thought that one through. But like, you know, it is what it is now. And so.
Thank you. I have now for the first time thought about the band name Jimmy Eat World. Like I will probably have to spend some more time on that.
Oh man, I hope those guys don't think I'm making fun of them. It's actually really funny. So the first drum library that we did that's no longer available, Jimmy Eat World is also from Phoenix, and those guys know my original business partner, and we actually went out to their studio and borrowed a bunch of mics and a bunch of drums. So like we actually sampled like the drums from, some of the drums from Bleed American, which is like one of my favorite records of all time. That was pretty cool.
That was great. I saw them once. They were great.
But I hope they don't think I'm making fun of them, because I really do love their band.
yeah, me too. No, not at all. I don't think so. I got two more questions here that I absolutely want to ask. The first one is something you kind of touched on in the beginning of this episode, where you said you need someone to not only be able to tune the drums, but like keep them in tune throughout the whole process. That is like something that I think is also relevant for our audience, because I cannot, like, I don't even know how many sessions I've received at this point that I had to mix where the setup and the sound and all was great, but like throughout the first song, you already hear the snare drifting slightly, and then further down the record, it's just completely changed. And I'm like, is that intentional? And they don't even notice, or sometimes they notice, but they don't know what to do about it. So how do you make sure that things stay in tune throughout these long sessions? And like, do you change drum heads in between? If so, when? And like, do you try to keep the same heads on, or like, how do you do it? How do you keep that consistency?
Well, so originally, one of like the big things that Jamie Wolford brought to the table was he is just the most amazing drum tech ever. And so when I work with him, and he teched the blasting room library, and he teched the bow library, as well as all of our older libraries. Mm-hmm. I actually learned a lot from watching him work. You can learn something from everybody. I don't care how long you've been in the game, For a lot of our libraries, I was just like, hey, Jamie, you got this? And he's like, I got this. And his method was, he has a little like tone generator, and he has the drummer play the drum like around, he calls it like going around the world. You take the snare off, or if you're on a snare or whatever, you tap at all the lugs while he plays this tone in his ear, and he can hear it. He's amazing watching him work. And we tune the drums to exact musical pitches with a musical interval between the batter head and the resonant head. That's just kind of, you sort of have to do it that way so that you have a number that you can get back to. I think getting to what you were saying, like a lot of times drummers will tune their drums, they sound good, but then they have no idea how to get back there.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And they're like afraid. So,
but you're talking about the fundamental here, right? Because like it's physically, this thing where people are arguing about this a lot online, where some people swear by tuning things to the pitch or like the key of the song or to a certain note, and then there are other texts who say like it's physically impossible to tune a drum to a certain note because it consists of so many overtones and harmonics, and they are not like correlated, and they're not part of the same key and all that sort of stuff. So you're talking about the fundamental note, the loudest thing that you see on the analyzer, basically that one, that frequency, and that is the pitch.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of like sort of high profile people that swear either way. I mean, like, I don't know how else to say it other than like, it is absolutely 100% possible to tune to musical pitches, and it makes a difference. I mean, I don't know. And what they're saying is not wrong, that there's like all these extra harmonics and stuff like that. Like, it's not going to sound like a sine wave, but at that moment where the drum head is deflecting the most and vibrating, like there is a fundamental that's there. And if you can optimize the batter and resonant head around that, it absolutely 100% is a note. Especially when you get on the stuff like floor tom. If you're like doon doon da doon 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 da, and you're playing along with a bass, and that floor tom is tuned to the key of the song, you can hear it. Like it is a musical thing. I hate to talk in absolutes, and I like to think that everybody's opinion is valid. But I mean, I just can't go along with people that say that there is no way to tune to musical pitches. I can hear it. Like it's there.
Yeah.
Not to say that they're wrong about the extra harmonics and whatever. That they're absolutely right. But like there is a fundamental.
Yeah.
And just to finish answering the question that you asked, when Jamie, there have been libraries where Jamie is not around. Like this Kurt library was like that. And the TuneBot by Overtone, I think it's Overtone Labs makes it.
Awesome.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I'm not endorsed by them or anything, but like I have made that company so much money talking about how awesome the TuneBot is. They should really be sending me free TuneBots. I mean,
it is.
Yeah. If you guys are listening, like hit me up. Like,
sure.
But yeah, the TuneBot is it's indispensable for what we do. And even Jamie now, like he'll check it with the TuneBot because he's great by ear, but it's like, when you got a number that you can reference,
Yep.
and it like within a tenth of a hertz, it'll give you a value. Ooh,
That's
man,
pretty cool.
Like,
and like you said, it's because you've put a value on it. You've put a note or a number that makes it possible to get back to it. So
yeah,
like
you can
answering
replicate
Benny's
it.
question is like, as the recording goes on and it drifts off and off, you can now go back to it. You're not just guessing, being like, I think it sounded like this. The only other way, just to speak to this myself, that I've seen it done was with, again, a drum tech who was among the best I've seen. It was a guy named Fabio in Vancouver, and we just recorded it at the beginning, and then we'd play it to him and be like, this is what we started at, and he'd be like, all right, and then he'd just tweak it like by ear kind of thing. But having a tool like the DrumBot just seems so much quicker and more accurate probably as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I've tried them all. I'm constantly like questing for better ways to do things. I've tried what's the one?
The tension watch?
The tension, yeah. Like the one that measures the drum head tension using that little like spring and needle design. It's like unusable. Like,
yeah, had the same experience because the tension drift changes for various reasons and not like and like it's not it just doesn't give you what it sounds like. It just measures the tension. Right. That's the problem in and of itself.
Yeah. Same with the lug tension one that just like only twists at a certain tension. It's like, well, if you got, an old drum where the lugs are all bent and stuff, it's
or like if one of your when you oiled the lug receptacles, if one of them got some grime or dirt in there, now it's way harder to turn, and also you asked about the drum head part of it. That's part of the pre-production thing. Like we try not to ever replace drum heads in the process of sampling because that just introduces a variable that we don't want to deal with. So the way that we do it is we arrange it so that the softest hits tend to be the first ones. And as you get to the end, and it's actually, the drum head stretching is actually, once you get it kind of seated and on there, the drum head stretching is not as big of a problem as like when you hit rim shots and stuff. Like if you were to watch that with a slow motion camera, like what's actually happening is the rim deforms.
Yeah.
Right. Like it presses down, which actually allows the lugs to rotate because of the vibration. And lug locks help with that a lot. But even still, like that's the real thing that causes the pitch drift.
Right.
If you've ever looked at like, especially triple flange things, like not die-cast, but triple flange hoops. If you looked at them, like after drummers have played them for a while, like even after a tour or so, they are not a perfect circle anymore oftentimes. Like they are all like weird because they are deformed. Yeah. Totally.
Yeah, and it's really interesting when you think or when you look at die-cast hoops versus triple flange, because triple flange are actually way easier to keep at their proper tuning because they're not like a solid piece like the die-cast. They kind of like move around like this, and so they're more tolerant to like. Like if you hit a rim shot in one section, it doesn't deform the whole thing. But with the die-cast hoop, it kind of is more rigid, which imparts a different sound, but it also like when you hit a rim shot, it is literally affecting every single lug, as opposed to a triple flange, which is like a little bit more sort of loose. I don't want to say loose, but like
forgiving or
bendy or whatever.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Haven't thought about that. Interesting. Good stuff. So yeah, you start with the quiet ones, and then you slowly get to the louder ones, and while you're doing that, you just check how often. Like, what is it? Just whenever you notice that it might be different, or do you have like certain intervals where you just retune anyways?
Guess how onerous the process of checking the tuning is. Take a guess. No one likes doing it.
Yeah,
we make them do it.
Of course.
I mean, we're basically part of the sampling process is, and I mean, everybody does this a little bit different. Like Kurt kind of like did it a little bit different, but when like the proper way, the way that I do it, and the result is always the same. We always check it, but I'll sit there with the TuneBot, and it'll pick up over the monitors. So I'll just be sitting there every time there's a hit. I'm listening to the fundamental,
right? And
then periodically we'll go back and check like we'll do a whole block of one velocity. At the end, play it back. Go to the beginning of that block, play that back. As long as they sound the same, we're good to move on. Right. If there is a change, we just go and redo the whole block.
Wow. Okay. All right.
I mean, it's every bit as bad as you can imagine.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That answers the question.
I've never been less attracted to making a drum sample library.
Like I think I'm really like talking myself out of collaborators with this one.
Yeah.
You know, I'm just like, this guy is nuts. I'm not getting involved with this.
Yeah, but that's exactly what I wanted for this episode, because it just this explains everything. This explains why they sound like they sound. This explains why it might take you longer for to get a library like perfect, but then when it's out, it actually just works and it does the thing, and like all these things that I was curious about. So this is perfect, and I think the people you want to work with and collaborate with appreciate that. So I don't think you're talking yourself out of anything. So that's perfect. So
I think it also helps people find the library they're looking for. Like if you're looking for something like so detail orientated and realistic, if you listen to this conversation, you're going to know that this is the company to look at first. It's just obvious.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's the thing. Like, there are so many great products out there. Like, it's never been if I would have had access to the things that we have access to now, not just with drums, but like with guitars and stuff, like that would have been mind blowing if I was like 16 and starting out and I could get the sounds that that 16-year-olds can make in their bedroom now. I mean, it's just crazy. Like, I love it.
Yeah.
Like, anybody who like longs for the good old days, like man, you either are just like intentionally have your head in the sand about technology, or like you were never actually around in the good old days, because the good old days, they weren't so good. You know, like aligning tape machines, like who wants to do that?
Yeah.
Only people that have never done it and are like, oh man, the sound of tape. Or like, because I used to work in a studio that had a tape machine, and it was a really nice, well-maintained tape machine. And they'd be like, every band would come in and be like, oh, we're going to do this on tape. I'm like, okay, cool. It's going to cost hundreds of dollars in tape. We're going to lose at least, give or take, an hour at the beginning of every day, which you're going to pay for.
Yeah.
While we align the machine, you know?
Yeah. Sure.
Also, you have to be really good, because unless you want to dump it into Pro Tools and edit, you got to be good.
Yeah.
You got to be able to play it. And then they're like, so about this Pro Tools thing you're talking about, like that sounds pretty cool too. You know, like,
I actually listened to that to a podcast interview with Steve Albini the other day. He was on. Do you know the Andrew Talks to Awesome People podcast? The Andrew Sheps. That Andrew Sheps does.
Yeah,
and he has an Albini episode there also, which is like a 4-hour interview, 5 hours, something crazy like that.
Awesome.
And Steve Albini says whenever he goes out of town, like to a different studio to produce with a band somewhere else, he always books an additional day before anybody shows up, just because he knows the tape machine is not going to be in a good working condition. He's going to have to set it up. He's going to have to do all sorts of things.
Right.
It's just always the case. So there's this whole extra day that everyone has to pay just to make sure that it works. And then, as you said, once you have a working machine, you have to do things every single day to just keep it working properly and all of these things. So, yeah.
Yeah, one thing that I will say, I actually did like an hour-long interview with Steve at Electrical as part of the process. Originally, it was I was just planning on getting like a couple sound bites, him talking about building the studio. He is absolutely like an incredibly sweet guy. Like, his reputation is kind of like, that he's kind of like a curmudgeon or whatever, but in my experience with him, he is just absolutely the sweetest guy. And the interview was so awesome that I was like, well, I'm not going to use this for like sound bites. Like, so much, we talked about so much cool stuff with the studio and all that stuff. I'm like, I gotta like spend some time with this, and like, I'm going to turn it into something for our YouTube channel, the Room Sounds YouTube channel. He's just an incredible guy, and he built an incredible studio. Like, I've never been in a studio that felt more. You could tell it was built to make records, not to like look good in Mix Magazine. Right. That's not to say that it doesn't look good, but it's like everywhere you turn, there's pens. There's like a cup holder with pens in it. They're a tape-based studio, so there's razor blades. Like, everywhere that you could possibly need a razor blade, you just turn around and it's there.
Awesome.
It's just an incredibly like artist and producer-friendly studio to work in. So shout out to those guys. And the staff is amazing. It's not just Steve. It's Taylor, the studio manager, and John, who helped us track. Like, everybody is good. Everybody's good at tape. Everybody's good at digital. They're just, I can't say enough good things about that that crew.
And to me, he actually doesn't even come across as that, because everything I've heard of him, and I've listened to so many interviews with him, because he's just an incredible engineer and person to me. And every time I hear him talk, I think he's one of the most respectful, thoughtful, like super smart people. And like everything, like the way he thinks before he says something, and the way how he says it. I don't think it's. I think actually it's really cool and respectful, and he really, and even if he makes a mistake or says something stupid, he is not afraid to admit that and apologize, and all these things. So, yeah, I don't know him personally, but everything I've heard so far was like fascinating in every aspect.
Yeah, we could all be a little more like Steve Albini, and the world would be a better place. I think.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so final thing from me here that I wanted to ask is. One is a question, and one is something that you started but haven't said about anything about after that. So the question was about the cutting samples. We kind of touched on that too, but like when people make their own samples at home, even if it's just one shots that we want to layer with something else, how do you actually do that properly? Like, do we leave a little gap before the waveform starts? Do we zoom in and like cut exactly when the first like sample goes up, like on the waveform? Like where do we do that? Because you say you do it always the same for every sample, of course, so that the phase relationship stays consistent. But where exactly is that? Like, what's a proper way of doing that?
Well, man, what a question. It seems it's like deceptively simple. Like, well, you start when the drum sample hits, but that's not actually what you do. So if you zoom in super, super fine, like to the maximum zoom level in Pro Tools, there is always a spot where you will see the waveform like shoot up. It is almost always preceded by what I call stick wind.
Yes.
Which is exactly what it sounds like.
I know exactly what you're talking. I can
it's
see
like
it.
It's just like this little low frequency bump that happens. And a lot of times if you use like tab to transient or like some sort of automatic thing, it doesn't know that that's not part of what you want, So the only way to make sure that you're actually getting that exact moment where the amplitude like shoots like crazy is to go in like down to the sample and make sure that you're cutting at that exact sample where that happens manually for 36,000 hits, which is what, which is what happened in this last library.
Oh man.
Yeah.
So this library is going to be out in 2030, and I'm joking, it's already out, but that's great.
I mean,
and you're not joking. Like it's literally 36,000 samples that you cut that way, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So just to clarify here, you were cutting after the stick wind at the actual hit.
After the stick wind, at the point where you can see it on the waveform. I wish I would have known this question. I would like give you a graphic to put up on the YouTube video or whatever. But like, I mean, you can see it. It's like this little thing is like whoop, boom, and then it goes through the roof.
Yeah,
and that's where you cut.
Yes,
that exact like down. When I say down to the sample, I don't mean down to the drum sample. I mean down to like 44,100 samples per second. Although we sample at 88 too, so down to the one sample of that 88 too.
Yeah,
like there's always a clear spot.
Yeah. So it's where it starts. It's not the peak of that thing shooting up. It's where it starts.
No, it's where it starts.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's how you like. Depending on how hard you hit it, there's like different. As you get down to the softer spots, like there's not as crazy of a stick wind or of a transient. But if you always started at the beginning, like it'll always be blendable and like phase coherent and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Awesome. So, because people might not be aware of that and might not know what I meant when I said that. It's just that when this is inconsistent, or if there's just a too big of a gap, then when you want to layer it, the sampler, something like Trigger, doesn't really know. They just fire the sample, and then this gap is part of the sample. And then it can be, in the worst case, it can be just late and sound like a flam, or it can be just slightly late, and then you are either lucky or unlucky with the phase relationship, and it's just not exact. It's not predictable, basically. Yeah. So yeah, but that also is even if you get it right, it's not actually. In my experience, at least, it's not really predictable sometimes, because then that also requires that what you detect is accurate, and you use MIDI notes or something that you then align with the samples, and then who knows, maybe there's a slight delay in the plugin or any sort of variable. So I rarely got to the point where it was like exactly where I wanted it to be.
Yeah, I mean, I will say this, a lot of times because people always ask, how do I use Trigger to do this properly? And, we have a support document that lays it out, but basically like Trigger can generate MIDI through its detection algorithm. And people are always like, oh yeah, but the MIDI always sounds off. It's like, well, it's not the MIDI. The MIDI is accurate. The problem is like automatic anything always has problems, right? Like, you guys are recording engineers, probably Malcolm, especially if you use Pro Tools, like a lot of times when you're doing like Beat Detective to fix drums, you spend more time correcting Beat Detective's dumb automatic mistakes than you do actually correcting the performance, 100%. Right? Which is why I do all my drum editing manually. I'm actually faster than Beat Detective because I don't have to worry about whatever goofball detection of the hits that Beat Detective is doing, And so it's like, it's the same thing with MIDI, everybody wants the easy answer. And the correct answer is that there is no automatic process that will work 100% of the time. No. And if you're doing any sort of like fast music or nuanced music with ghost notes, forget about it. You just have to dig in and do the manual work if you want it to be perfect. Mm-hmm. If you want that triggering to be perfect. There is no magic bullet. Like, I don't care what the marketing material of, like the tracker from Superior or Slate's marketing team. I mean, like, I'm not trying to talk smack on those companies. Like, they both make incredible products, but it's like, sometimes you just got to be a musician and dig in there and do it yourself, like.
And they'll admit that it's not perfect. Like, nothing automatic is ever perfect. So, yeah, for sure. Cool, thank you. And the final thing that you said, it's not a question, but you started to talk about it, was like there's two options, tape and digital, on the Kerpaloo library, where I wanted to ask you like about that. So just so people know what you meant there, there's like these samples have been recorded twice, so we're talking even more than those 36,000 samples.
Well, the 36,000 is taking into account the tape and the digital versions.
Did you print the digital ones to tape after the fact, or did you record it twice, once to tape and once to digital?
No, so what we did was we did everything digitally, because one of the things about this is like, when you're making a record, noise is less of a problem. But when you're doing samples, those samples oftentimes will stack on top of one another. So any sort of noise that you pick up along the way gets compounded. And like, there will be points, if you're playing like a wild death metal song or something in this electrical library, you might have 1,000 voices playing. I'm not kidding. Simultaneously, 1,000 voices. So when I talk about how efficient Kontakt is, the fact that you can do that on a mid-tier computer, rock on, Native Instruments. I'm never going to leave you.
What is a voice though? Like, so just so people understand what you mean there when you say 1,000 voices, what does that mean? Like, basic explanation.
Every sample is a voice. So like, let's say I hit the snare drum. Well, there's 20 channels total when you factor in the mono and the stereo microphones in this library. And they're all individually addressable. So like, nothing is kind of pre-mixed. You get access to the full multi-track. So if you have full bleed, which means that the drums are bleeding through all of the adjacent microphones, like the snares bleeding into the toms and, whatever. Every single snare hit is 20 samples playing back simultaneously.
Right, because it's like the bleed wave file from the tom mic one.
Right.
Okay, so, wow, I never considered that. That's amazing.
So then, that's just one hit. So you've got 20 instances of noise playing, right? Yeah. But you don't just cut the sample whenever the next sample hits. There's like a fade out period. And, and because of how complex our engine is, especially with cymbals, that fade out period is different depending on the context.
Right.
And so again, like you might have 4 or 5 cymbals ringing simultaneously, all with multiple hits in the voice cue at the same time. So again, like you can have 1,000 samples playing at once. And if you are not meticulous about your noise control, I mean, it just turns into a hissy mess, right? Especially on the tails and stuff. So we recorded it to these with these. I think they were Apogee, like super high spec digital converters that they have at Electrical. And then we denoised that. Even though the noise floor at electrical is incredibly low, we went even further and we denoised the digital samples. And we record at 88.2. We deliver at 44.1, but we record it and process everything at 88.2 so we can even be more aggressive with, like how much noise we get rid of. And then once we auditioned, printed, all by hand, all of those samples, then we went back through and rearranged and put them into a thing that we could then feed through their tape machines. And they have a pair of Studer A820s, which is a digitally controlled tape machine. They're basically the greatest tape machine ever made. They were made to be like the spare no expense kind of like ultimate incarnation of tape. And we did that with Taylor Hales, the studio manager. He's an incredible engineer. And so we basically put together a Pro Tools session that had all the samples laid out. And then we just fed them through the tape machine, played them back off the repro head. So they were all like perfectly in phase. And then went through and did a whole other round of crazy denoising.
Right.
To make, and that was why we never did tape before. This, again, just like the Studio B thing, it was an experiment. I was like, you know what? If we're ever going to do tape, this is the studio to do it in because they are a tape-based studio and all of their stuff works, Right. So we did it. I went through, I cut it all up. I didn't know until the end if it was going to work.
Yep.
Turns out it worked. And so it made it in. But I will say, if there was any problems with that tape, we would have thrown those tape samples out. All that work that I did, we would have just tossed it in the bin, because nothing is going to get into these libraries that we don't back 100%.
Cool.
And it worked out that the two big experiments that we had on this one, they kind of panned out in a good way. So,
and it's also a good way of like learning that. I think I thought it was exciting to try that feature with the tape because it's a good way of learning how like subtle of a difference tape can actually be, because there is a difference, and especially if you listen to all the channels and not just one, it kind of adds up. But still, people think of tape as this like drastic difference, like everything sounds completely different or warmer or whatever words they use, and then they use like very hype tape plugins that sometimes have a very obvious effect if you just turn them on and stuff. But in this library, you can see if you do the A/B, there is a difference, but it's very subtle. It's just a recording medium, and it has its own maybe like vibe and sound and stuff, but it's not that it's like a crazy night and day difference. And that is, I think, is important that you did that because, again, don't want to name names, but there are plugins out there where they just made the output 1.5 dB louder or stuff, or boosted the bass so that people, when you turn it on, you think it's just warmer and louder and better and fatter, but you didn't do that. It's just slightly different.
Well, one of the things that's really interesting about tape, and I think it kind of has to do with that generational gap where like people kind of like they have this fascination with older records, but they don't actually understand like the problem of recording in that way. But the thing you always hear about is this like saturation and compression and all that stuff. But if you're getting like audible effects like that, if it's not subtle, like you're pushing the tape too hard. Like that's not good engineering. If there is like a drastic difference in the sound, like what comes out of tape should basically be what goes into it. Like, yeah, it might round off the transient a little, but unless you've got a bunch of other stuff and you're listening super critically, like you're like, oh, it feels different. Like I can't quite put my finger on what it is. And that's proper use of tape, but if you're getting like massive distortion or compression, like you're using it wrong. That's out of spec.
Yeah, it's a little difference that could add up to a big feeling across many tracks, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Dave, where do people go if they want to get this?
www.roomsound.com.
They never would have figured that out without you telling them, I'm sure. But
yeah,
that is awesome. People, check this out. All the libraries sound amazing. And Benny actually is the one that introduced me to your stuff. And Benny's just been I don't know if you're aware of this, but Benny is like probably your most vocal champion out there.
I was listening to the podcast last week. So I got married like almost exactly a week ago.
Congratulations.
And where my wife and I got married, it's in upstate New York. It's like an 8-hour drive. So we were listening to podcasts and stuff. And we listened to the podcast where basically like the first 10 minutes, it was just like, you guys like talking about how much you enjoyed that library. And I was like, oh man. My wife's like, oh man, you're going to have such a big head after this thing.
Yeah, I've been saying it before, like really, and I mean it. And just so people know, that's also something I tell them all the time. I have an affiliate link and I don't hide that. So I get a commission if you buy through that link. But I've bought every single one of the libraries myself just because I love them and I enjoy them. So it's not something I promote just because, for whatever reasons, I really, really love them. And so I've been saying that to people all the time. So
it's great.
No, I appreciate it. Like we're a real small company, and every little bit helps. A lot of our sort of, marketing is built around just like being good to people and like having people, come to us kind of like naturally and organically. And, so we really do appreciate everybody that buys a copy of the library, whatever. Like we're not some like giant faceless company. There's like only a few people that work for the company and it's all very like, sort of like, I kind of like to think of Room Sounds as kind of like the boutique pedal makers, that aren't, there's nothing wrong with Boss pedals, but like there's some like really cool, like sort of independent businesses that do that. And I like to think of Room Sound the same way,
Awesome.
Awesome.
Well, yeah. Thanks again, man. It's been fascinating learning more about the inner workings of such a detailed engine and how that comes together. Like, really, really fascinating. Thank you.
It's been great talking to you guys. I don't get to nerd out, about the real minutia of this stuff very often. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Totally. Thank you. And talking about nerding out, what if people want to like reach out to you, but not about Room Sound, but just as an engineer? Because I mean, if someone wants to record drums that are really meticulously engineered with like, you would be the guy probably also. So I don't know, but like, what if people want to reach out to you just for your drum wisdom or your engineering skills? Is there a thing you do?
I mean, I teach at a college in town here. So shout out to Cuyahoga Community College. You should check that out. It's an amazing facility. I teach there. But if you want to just reach out to me or whatever, my website is davepiatek.com. There's a contact link there. Just, send me a message. I'll answer whatever questions anybody wants.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, thank you again for your time. Really appreciate it. And if there's anything that you want to add, do it now.
That's all I got.
Awesome. Perfect.
Great.
All right.
We covered a lot here.
We did. We covered a ton.
Did.
Yeah,
we did. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Have a good one, guys.
Bye.